It was in the salons of Regency London, beneath chandeliers that trembled with candle flame, that Lady Caroline Lamb first whispered of Lord Byron that he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. A phrase carried like smoke through the drawing rooms of the city, lingering on the lips of strangers, already transforming passion into legend. Welcome, my wandering listener, to this story told across distance and years. Wherever you are, in still night or quiet dawn, you are invited to let me know when and where these words reach you. In this way, we weave a small memory together across time. And if you wish to keep company with these timeless histories, you may press the subscribe button, a little gesture that helps our circle of listeners endure. The story of Lady Caroline Lamb begins not in scandal, but in the hush of aristocratic corridors where young voices were trained to speak softly and carry the memory of lineage. Born into the family of the Earl of Bessborough, Caroline was a child of privilege, raised in an age where the weight of ancestry was as binding as iron. Yet from her earliest days, she seemed touched with restlessness. Those who observed her in childhood noted her quickness of wit, the sudden flash of temper, the way she would resist instruction and laugh at solemn authority. It was as if a spark of something untamable had been planted in her, and no schooling could quite diminish it. Her beauty was often remarked upon, though not the serene loveliness expected of a lady destined for courtly grace. Instead, hers was a face that seemed to change with each mood. At times it shone with almost ethereal delicacy, at others it twisted into mischief or defiance so that onlookers felt unsettled. She did not cultivate the art of stillness that society prized. Rather, she moved with nervous energy, as if forever resisting the invisible walls of convention. One wonders whether she sensed even as a girl that her life would never find peace in quiet conformity. She was married young, as was customary, to William Lamb, a man of gentleness and intelligence, who would in time become Lord Melbourne and a figure of political stature. Their union was one of arrangement rather than passion, yet William seemed at first to provide Caroline with patience and indulgence. Still, even in those early years, she grew restless, and her mind wandered toward literature, toward the secret world of imagination that could never be bound by duty. She read voraciously, scribbled verses, and entertained her circle with spirited conversation that sometimes verged upon scandalous. Already she was setting herself apart, for in a society ruled by restraint, her hunger for intensity marked her as dangerous to tradition. It is said that even as a young bride, she would walk through the grand houses of London as though she were both a guest and a captive, laughing too loudly, singing when silence was expected, watching others with a gaze that pierced rather than flattered. Some found her enchanting, others whispered that she was unstable. Perhaps both were true. In Caroline, the boundary between brilliance and recklessness was already thin. One might pause to ask, was it fate that she should meet Byron, or merely the inevitable collision of two restless souls who could not endure the dullness of ordinary life? For long before they exchanged words, their paths were prepared by rumor. He was spoken of as a young poet of scandalous renown, beautiful and troubled, a man whose verses carried both melody and darkness. She was spoken of as a woman of high birth yet dangerous volatility, her spirit unquiet, her conversation wild. It is almost as though London itself conspired to bring them together, two flames drawn by gossip and expectation, destined to ignite. But before Byron enters her tale, Caroline's own early character must be understood. Without this, the later descent into obsession seems merely madness. Yet if we linger in her youth, we see a different possibility. Her restlessness was also creativity, her laughter also wit, her defiance also courage. There were moments when she shone brightly in the company of others, when her refusal to bow to dull propriety brought life to otherwise stifled gatherings. In such moments, She was not a figure of tragedy, but of vitality. Perhaps those around her might have admired rather than condemned had they been willing to accept a woman who lived with such force. But in Regency England, the freedom of a woman was tightly bound, and every act of rebellion was seen as a fall from grace. The years of her girlhood slipped quickly, as they did for all young ladies of the aristocracy, into the responsibilities of marriage, of social attendance, of presentation before the scrutinizing eyes of society. Yet within Caroline there remained the heart of a child untamed, forever longing to run beyond the hedges of her gardens, to chase not security, but sensation. And so, her marriage to William, kind as it was, could never satisfy. He was patient, he was forgiving, but he was steady, and steadiness was the very thing she could not bear. In the quiet of domestic life, she grew restless, almost desperate. It was in this hunger that the soil of obsession was prepared. When we imagine her in these early days, perhaps we can picture her in a candle-lit chamber, restless after a night at some grand assembly, still clad in silks and pearls, yet unable to sleep. Perhaps she gazed from her window onto the moonlit gardens, whispering lines of poetry, half remembered, her heart beating fast with no cause but longing. Longing for what? For danger, for intensity, for a love that would lift her above the stifling rituals of rank. Was this not the same longing that poets themselves poured into their verses, that restless reaching for something beyond the safe and ordinary? It is here, in this space between youthful rebellion and the fateful meeting with Byron, that Caroline's soul must be held in contemplation. She was not yet ruined, not yet infamous. She was still a woman poised upon the edge of possibility, both fragile and radiant. One might say that in these moments she still had the choice to turn towards steadiness, to live quietly in the grace of her station. Yet would she have been herself had she chosen so? Would Caroline Lamb be remembered at all if she had not reached beyond the safe boundaries into the fire? The story now trembles on the edge of its first great turn, for beyond the guarded gates of her world, Byron had returned from his travels, his poetry already casting shadows and light upon England's imagination. Whispers of his beauty, his cruelty, his genius had already drifted to Caroline's ears, and she, restless and searching, would not resist the pull for long. But before we enter that fateful meeting, let us remain for a moment longer with the image of Caroline as a young woman, poised in the hush of her chamber, her restless spirit beating against the bars of propriety, listening in the distance to the faint sound of carriage wheels on the night road. The sound grows softer, as though some destiny approaches, not yet seen but already on its way. The carriage wheels that whispered along the stones outside her chamber seemed to roll forward into her destiny, carrying with them the figure whose name was already echoing in salons and drawing rooms. Those wheels belong not to any single coach, but to the restless passage of London nights, nights when polished floors shone beneath chandeliers, when powdered faces turned and bowed, when words carried farther than deeds. Within this society, Lord Byron moved like a newly arrived comet, dazzling and feared, the young poet whose child herald had taken England by storm, whose pale face and dark eyes unsettled both men and women alike. His return from his travels was a tale already embroidered by gossip, yet no embroidery could equal the impression of his presence. And it was in such gatherings, with candlelight trembling on glass and silk, that Caroline Lamb first set eyes upon him. The gaze across the ballroom was not unusual, for many eyes lingered on Byron. He carried with him that dangerous mixture of beauty and disdain, of brilliance and melancholy. Those who admired him could not be sure whether he sought them or merely tolerated their admiration, and therein lay the magnetism. He was spoken of as if he belonged not wholly to the present company, but partly to some darker realm of imagination. Caroline, restless and keen, was struck at once, and it is said that she watched him with a fascination that disregarded discretion. For in him she saw not merely a man, but the mirror of her own longing for intensity, a spirit equally unwilling to bow to quiet safety. Their first conversations, when they finally came, carried the weight of destiny disguised as mere flirtation. He teased, she retorted. He recited, she replied with wit of her own. The onlookers were amused, perhaps a little alarmed. It was clear to many that Caroline had found in Byron not a passing distraction, but a figure around whom her imagination could coil. In her marriage to William, she had found steadiness, patience, and safety. But in Byron, she glimpsed danger, poetry, the promise of fire. And was not fire what she had always sought? The society of Regency England was both indulgent and cruel. Affairs, though common, were spoken of in whispers and could swiftly ruin reputations. But Caroline was not cautious, and Byron did not shrink from scandal. Their meetings grew bolder, their conversations less guarded, until rumor moved as swiftly as the carriages themselves. Some friends counseled her to step back, to remember her station, to protect her name. Yet Caroline, intoxicated by passion and by the thrill of defiance, laughed at caution. She had never desired safety, and now she believed she had found a love worthy of risk. It is difficult across the years to separate fact from embroidery, for their affair quickly became legend. Yet what remains certain is the intensity of Caroline's devotion and the recklessness with which she displayed it. She sent him letters thick with feeling. She pursued his presence with disregard for discretion. She abandoned the measured calm expected of a lady of her rank. Byron, in turn, seemed at first amused, then flattered, then entangled. He admired her wit, her daring, her refusal to play the part of the submissive admirer. She matched him in quickness, in passion, in volatility. It was perhaps inevitable that what began as fascination would grow into a storm. Reflecting on these first encounters, one cannot help but wonder what each truly sought. Did Byron, whose heart was always divided between longing and contempt, see in Caroline a kindred spirit or merely a diversion? Did Caroline, whose life had been shaped by restlessness, mistake his cruelty for depth, his melancholy for the proof of genius? Perhaps passion once ignited cares little for such distinctions. Perhaps she saw in him only what her own imagination required, the embodiment of danger, of rebellion, of poetry itself. There are those who claim that she was warned from the beginning. Some whispered to her that Byron was no man for loyalty, that his charm was a mask for bitterness, that he would tire of her as he tired of all. But warnings rarely cool the heat of obsession. Indeed, for Caroline, the very danger may have been part of the attraction. To love safely was to live dully. To love dangerously was to live fully, even if ruin awaited. She was, after all, a woman who once declared that it was better to sin passionately than to endure in silence. The ballroom, the gardens, the dim-lit corridors of Mayfair houses all became stages upon which their glances, their words, their very proximity created rumor. The city watched, amused, scandalized, enthralled, and Caroline, once a restless lady on the margins of society's attention, now stood at the very center of its gaze. There is an image one might hold. A candle-lit room, crowded yet hushed, Byron leaning indifferently against a marble mantel, Caroline's eyes fixed upon him with a brightness that revealed too much, the company watching with secretive glances, knowing that something forbidden had already begun. Yet love, or what passed for it, is never only about public fascination. Behind closed doors, their passion burned in words and in gestures. Caroline, whose imagination had long been starved, poured herself into him. She listened to his verses as if they were scripture. She read his expressions as if they were prophecy. And Byron, whose vanity was as great as his genius, accepted such devotion with both pleasure and cruelty. He allowed her closeness, yet withheld full tenderness. He invited her passion, yet mocked her intensity. Already the imbalance was present, and already the seeds of torment were sown. Was she blind to his coldness? Or did she see it and only love him the more for it, mistaking cruelty for depth, mistaking disdain for strength? These are questions that history cannot answer, but they linger as shadows over their story. For passion does not always thrive on kindness. Sometimes it feeds more hungrily on rejection. Perhaps Caroline, who longed for fire, believed that even pain was proof of love. As the weeks passed, the city's rumor deepened into scandal. Caroline appeared reckless in her devotion, careless of consequence. Friends shook their heads. Families whispered of disgrace. William, her husband, watched with sorrow and resignation, unwilling or unable to contain her. And still Caroline pressed on, drawn deeper into Byron's orbit, as though she could not stop even if she wished. There is a kind of fate that does not arrive from outside but rises from within. And perhaps, for Caroline, the meeting with Byron was not merely accident, but the inevitable flowering of the seed planted long ago in her restless youth. And so the gaze across the crowded ballroom lengthened into nights of whispered passion, into letters burned and sealed, into moments that defied society's watchful eye. She was already no longer the Caroline of steady grace, but the Caroline of obsession, of fire, of danger. And still, in that moment before the storm would break, there was a sweetness, a thrill, a sense that she had at last found the intensity she craved. Yet the sweetness, like candlelight, could not endure. For even as her devotion deepened, Byron's heart remained cold, divided, mocking, and the carriage wheels that first carried him into her gaze would soon carry him away, leaving her in the shadows of scandal. But before that departure, the flame would burn hotter still until it threatened to consume them both. A single glance across a ballroom, the rustle of silk, the hush of voices, the bright tremor of chandeliers. These were the beginnings of a love that was already ruin. And from this gaze, one can still imagine the moment stretching endlessly, as though the ballroom itself held its breath, waiting for the first letter to be written, the first secret to be confessed, the first step into obsession. And somewhere, in the quiet after music has ended, one may still hear the faint sound of a letter being slipped into a drawer, half burnt, trembling with words too dangerous to read aloud. The drawer closes with a sigh of wood, yet within it lies the trembling secret of words that should never have been written. A letter half burnt and half preserved, its ink still bearing the heat of reckless confession. Such was the beginning of their intimacy. For Byron and Caroline did not love in silence. They loved in writing, in a torrent of letters that carried more fire than their spoken words. To open such a letter was to invite both ecstasy and torment, for each word could cut as sharply as it caressed, and each phrase was as much a weapon as a gift. In these pages, Caroline poured herself without restraint. Her hand trembled across the paper, her emotions too vast to be contained by grammar or decorum. She confessed, she demanded, she yielded, she threatened. And Byron, ever the master of language, replied with words that could inflame or wound, often both at once. For him, writing was performance as much as passion. He could make his pen a blade, slicing into her vulnerability with irony or indifference, then soften it in the next line with a tenderness that seemed almost sincere. In such letters, one may glimpse the entire arc of their affair, the sweetness, the cruelty, the obsession, the despair. It is said that Caroline would carry his notes pressed to her chest, that she would read them in the quiet of her chamber until her tears blurred the ink. She guarded them as though they were relics of holiness, and when anger rose in her, she would burn them only halfway, unable to let them go entirely. The ashes of passion and the fragments of paper together became her companions, the visible proof of a love that consumed her. This love was no quiet affection, no serene companionship. It was a storm, unpredictable and violent, shifting from rapture to agony within the space of a breath. Those around her began to see the signs of obsession, the way she spoke his name as though it were a charm, the way her eyes flickered toward the door at every gathering, hoping for his arrival, the way she dismissed caution with laughter that sounded more like desperation. For Caroline, Byron was no longer a man. He was the embodiment of the longing that had always burned within her. She could not separate the poet from the poetry, the man from the myth. But Byron, for all his brilliance, was never made for constancy. He thrived on conquest, on novelty, on the fleeting intoxication of admiration. Caroline's devotion at first amused him, then flattered him, then began to weary him. He saw in her intensity not merely passion but danger, for she was unwilling to play the quiet role of a hidden lover. She was extravagant in her affection, reckless in her displays, too visible in her pursuit. Where others might have been content with secrecy, Caroline demanded presence, recognition, and above all, totality. She could not love by halves, and he could not endure to be possessed so completely. Thus their letters became not only declarations of love, but battlefields of will. Here one sees the cruel paradox of their affair, that the very qualities which drew them together, her intensity, his allure, were also those that would drive them apart. Caroline, who longed for danger, found herself wounded by the very cruelty she had mistaken for passion. Byron, who delighted in admiration, found himself suffocated by the very devotion he had invited. Each word written between them was both a thread that bound and a knife that cut, drawing them deeper into a web from which neither could escape without harm. We may wonder, as we read of these letters, whether love itself was ever truly present, or whether both were merely actors upon a stage of their own making. Was Caroline in love with Byron, or with the idea of Byron, the genius, the rebel, the dark romantic? Was Byron in love with Caroline, or with the reflection of his own power mirrored in her desperation? Perhaps the truth lies not in one or the other, but in the uneasy blend where affection and cruelty, tenderness and vanity mingled too closely to be disentangled. In any case, the letters remained, proof of a passion that defied society. And society, ever hungry for scandal, whispered more loudly, rumors of clandestine meetings, of reckless encounters, of scenes too wild for polite company, spread through the drawing rooms of London. Caroline did little to hide her infatuation. Indeed, some said she flaunted it, daring the world to condemn her. Byron, by contrast, began to retreat, uneasy at the growing exposure, already considering escape. Yet he could not fully let go, for there was something in Caroline's fire that both enthralled and horrified him. He mocked her even as he returned to her, rejected her even as he drew her back. The cruelty of his oscillation deepened her obsession, for rejection only sharpened her hunger. Imagine her then, in the solitude of her chamber, the drawer of letters half filled with burnt fragments, her face pale from sleeplessness, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Imagine her reading the same phrases again and again, seeking in them some promise that was never given, some truth that was never clear. Her fingers traced the ink as though it were flesh, her breath catching at a line that could be read as devotion or disdain. What madness it is to find in every word the possibility of salvation, even when the words themselves wound. Her friends, her family, even her husband began to despair. Some pitied her, some condemned her, some tried in vain to counsel her toward reason. But reason was no longer possible. Caroline was not merely in love, she was consumed, possessed by a force greater than herself. To let go of Byron was to let go of the very intensity that had always defined her life. Without him, she would be only another lady of society, restless and unfulfilled. With him, even in torment, she felt alive, and so she clung to him, even as he slipped away, even as he wounded her, even as society sharpened its knives of gossip. Thus the half-burnt letters became symbols of her own heart, destroyed yet preserved, wounded yet unwilling to surrender. Each fragment whispered of love and ruin, of passion that could not be hidden, of madness that was already beginning to show. And still, even as the ink darkened, the wax cooled, and the paper charred, Caroline believed that Byron might yet love her as wholly as she loved him, believed that passion could bend reality, that devotion could overcome cruelty, believed, even against reason, that fire could warm without destroying. But fire, once lit, consumes, and soon the letters would no longer be enough, for passion demands more than words. It demands presence, touch, defiance. And Caroline, unwilling to be hidden in a drawer like her letters, would soon carry her obsession into the public eye, where society's judgment would not be delayed. The drawer closes again, this time with a sharper sound, as though it cannot contain the heat within, and from the cooling wax upon the seal, a faint crack is heard, like a warning of something breaking, something that cannot be mended. The wax cools with a faint crack, brittle now as though language itself has hardened into a shell, too fragile to hold the heat it once contained. Their letters, once tender with the breath of passion, grew sharper, their words not only caresses but weapons wielded in turn. For Caroline and Byron both understood the power of writing, the way a phrase could draw blood more swiftly than a blade. In their correspondence, intimacy and violence walked hand in hand, inseparable, each stroke of the pen both an embrace and a wound. Caroline's letters overflowed with longing. She did not measure her words, but poured them forth with the desperation of one who believed her soul was at stake. She wrote of her sleepless nights, of her hunger for his presence, of the torment of his coldness. She accused, she pleaded, she surrendered. Her hand, it is said, often trembled as she wrote, the ink blotting, the lines rushing, as if her very heartbeat dictated the pace of the pen. In her letters there was no restraint, no mask of propriety. They were naked, raw confessions of a love too great for silence. Byron's replies were of another kind. He, too, could write with brilliance, and when he chose tenderness, his words could intoxicate. But he seldom gave tenderness without irony, seldom offered devotion without shadow. His letters might begin with flattery and end with mockery, or they might respond to her passion with cold indifference. He played upon her vulnerability, alternately drawing her close and pushing her away. For Byron, language was a game as much as a confession, and in this game he held the greater mastery. Caroline, for all her wit, was disarmed by her own intensity. She could not withhold, she could not feign indifference. Every letter she sent was a surrender, and every reply from Byron was a reminder of her peril. These exchanges became the rhythm of their affair, an ebb and flow of hope and despair. Caroline, receiving a phrase of warmth, would be lifted into rapture, only to be cast down by the next line's disdain. She lived upon his words, as though each letter were bread and wine to her soul. The letters she did not receive were worse than the cruel ones, for silence was torment beyond expression. In such moments she would write again, desperate, reckless, unable to stop, her drawer filled with copies, drafts, and fragments, as though her very being was dissolving into ink. But love expressed only in words, and words sharpened by cruelty, cannot endure without consequence. Already her friends began to notice the signs of strain. She grew pale, restless, distracted. At gatherings, she would speak of Byron openly, even when discretion was demanded. She no longer cared who heard, for her love was too vast to be hidden. Those who once found her charming began to whisper of instability, of impropriety, of scandal. Yet Caroline seemed heedless. Perhaps she believed that the force of her passion could defy society's judgment, that her love was stronger than the world's disapproval. Or perhaps she no longer cared, for what was reputation compared to the torment of love? The sealing of each letter became itself a ritual. Caroline would press the hot wax with shaking fingers, as if the act might bind Byron to her more securely. But wax, like love, cools and hardens, and the crack upon its surface foretold the breakage to come. She may have sensed it in some unguarded moment that her passion was already slipping from his grasp, that his replies grew shorter, his patience thinner. And still she wrote, unable to stop, for obsession does not yield to reason. There is something haunting in the image of those letters, sheets of paper filled with desperate ink, sealed in wax, carried through the London streets by servants unaware of the weight they bore. How many times did she wait at her window, listening for the sound of a messenger's footsteps, her heart racing at the thought of his reply? How many times did she clutch a letter to her breast, as though the paper itself could warm her? These details, though small, reveal the vastness of her inner storm. Each letter was a lifeline, each absence a drowning. Byron, meanwhile, grew wary. His vanity was pleased, but his freedom was threatened. He saw in Caroline's intensity not only devotion, but danger, for she was too visible, too outspoken, too unwilling to be hidden. He feared the scandal that already whispered his name in connection with hers, feared the mockery of his peers, feared perhaps even the depth of her love, for it demanded more than he could give. And so his words grew colder, his presence less frequent. He began to withdraw, not fully, but with enough cruelty to torment her. He left her in uncertainty, which is perhaps the most painful form of rejection. Caroline responded not with retreat, but with greater fervor, for rejection only deepened her need, only inflamed her passion. She wrote more, demanded more, pursued him with a recklessness that shocked her friends and delighted the gossips of London. She could not see that the very force of her love was driving him away, or perhaps she did see and could not stop. For obsession is not blind, it is sight sharpened to pain, aware of every cruelty yet powerless to resist. And so their letters, once tokens of intimacy, became weapons in a battle neither could win. They wounded each other with phrases, drew blood with ink, and yet could not stop. The drawer filled, the wax cracked, the words turned bitter. Society watched, whispering more loudly, waiting for the scandal to burst into open disgrace. Caroline, caught between her own longing and Byron's cruelty, seemed all ready to unravel. And still she wrote as though writing itself could save her. One might pause here to wonder, what is it in words that can so enthrall the heart? Why should ink upon paper carry more weight than presence, more torment than silence? Perhaps because words once written cannot be unsaid. They remain lingering, echoing, long after the voice has ceased. For Caroline, the letters were not merely communication. They were proof that her passion existed, that her love was not a dream. She could hold them, read them, press them to her lips. They were the only solidity in a love that was otherwise fleeting. And yet, like all solid things, they became heavy, too heavy to bear. The wax cracks again, louder this time, and the words within spill out like smoke, filling the room with both sweetness and bitterness. Caroline leans over her desk, her face pale, her hand trembling, as another letter begins to take form beneath her pen. Outside, the city stirs with whispers, and in the stillness of the chamber, the flame of the candle burns low, its wax dripping steadily, as though marking the slow decline of hope. The candle flickers low, its flame bending toward extinction, and in that wavering light a phrase was born that would echo across centuries. Caroline, weary from sleepless nights of writing and weeping, spoke of Byron with words that have outlived them both: mad, bad, and dangerous to know. It was not written in some carefully composed letter, nor spoken in the grandeur of an oration, but whispered in the intimacy of confidences, passed from lips to ears until it became part of the city's rumor. A phrase simple and sharp, it captured the paradox of Byron's allure and cruelty more fully than volumes of prose ever could. In those 6 words, Caroline gave voice to what so many felt, yet few dared to name, and with them she sealed her own place in the history of scandal and memory. What did she mean by it, truly? Perhaps madness was the least literal of the 3, for Byron was no more insane than he was sane. His mind was brilliant, quick, and shadowed. Yet to love him was indeed to enter a kind of madness, for he drew others beyond reason into a world of torment and delight. Bad, certainly, was the judgment of morality, for his conduct flouted convention, his affairs left ruin behind him, his wit cut as cruelly as his indifference. And dangerous, there lay the heart of the phrase, for Byron was a danger not of body, but of soul. To know him intimately was to risk destruction, to lose one's peace, perhaps even one's very sense of self. Thus Caroline, in the clarity of her suffering, gave to language a description as immortal as his poetry. Yet the phrase, though cutting, was not an act of detachment. It was the cry of a heart still bound, a confession of danger uttered by one who could not walk away from it. Caroline named him dangerous, but still returned to his presence, still wrote her burning letters, still sought him in the crowded assemblies of Mayfair. To know the danger is not to escape it. Often it binds us more tightly. For in declaring him mad and bad, she gave him the glamour of forbiddenness, which only deepened her obsession. The Society of London, hungry for such words, seized upon the phrase. It repeated in drawing rooms, it was whispered behind fans, it was scribbled into notes passed at soirees. Caroline's remark became a kind of currency, proof that she had known him closely enough to judge him, proof also of her own scandalous entanglement. Her reputation, already fraying, now became inseparably linked to Byron's. She was the woman who named him dangerous, and the woman ruined by the very danger she named. One cannot help but see the irony, and perhaps even a touch of fate, that she herself became the most vivid example of her own warning. For Byron, the words may have stung, but they also added to his legend. To be called mad, bad, and dangerous to know was no insult to a poet who thrived on the aura of the outlawed and forbidden. It suited the dark mask he cultivated, the image of the Byronic hero that his readers adored. Caroline had meant to capture his cruelty, but she also gave him a gift, the perfect epitaph for his living myth. Thus, even in her attempt to define and condemn, she contributed to the very power that held her captive. What is striking in this moment is not only the brilliance of the phrase, but the way it encapsulates Caroline's own state of mind. For if Byron was dangerous to know, then she was already lost within that danger. She could see him clearly, could describe him more honestly than many others, and yet she could not release herself. Her clarity of perception did not bring her freedom. It deepened her torment. Perhaps this is the cruelest truth of obsession, that knowing its madness does not weaken its hold. As the candle burned low and the phrase spread outward, Caroline's nights grew darker. She could not keep silence, nor could she maintain dignity. She laughed too loudly, spoke too freely, exposed her pain in ways that scandalized her circle. Some pitied her, seeing in her wildness the marks of a woman undone. Others mocked her, taking her desperation as entertainment. Few offered compassion, for society seldom forgives a woman's passion, especially when it becomes too visible. In every whisper of mad, bad, and dangerous, her own name was entwined, as the lover who had both uttered the words and been consumed by them. And yet, in her restlessness, Caroline also wrote. She did not only pen letters to Byron, she began to pour her spirit into novels, veiled but transparent in their confessions. Through fiction, she sought to give shape to her suffering, to turn her scandal into story. Her writings were as reckless as her love, filled with thinly disguised portraits of Byron, filled with raw passion that defied literary decorum. In this, too, she blurred the line between intimacy and violence, between art and revenge. For each page was another form of letter, another attempt to capture and contain the man who had eluded her. The candle flickers once more, the flame unsteady, the wax dripping like slow tears. Caroline watches it as though it were her own heart, consumed by fire yet collapsing into nothingness. Did she know, as she spoke those 6 words, that they would survive her? Did she imagine that they would echo long after her novels were forgotten, long after her beauty had faded, long after Byron himself had gone to his grave? Perhaps not. Perhaps she only sought in that moment to give voice to her own anguish. And yet history is made often by such unguarded cries, by words spoken in despair that outlast entire lifetimes. In this image of the candle, burning low, flickering, nearly extinguished, one can see the symbol of Caroline herself, brilliant, unsteady, consumed by flame. The phrase she uttered was both her truth and her undoing, for it bound her forever to the man she could not escape. And as the flame trembles, threatening to die, the room is filled with shadows, the whisper of gossip outside growing louder, the sound of laughter fading into silence. The candle guttered, then flared once more, throwing a sudden light against the walls as if in final defiance. The sudden flare of the candle threw its light against the paneled walls, and then it faltered, leaving the chamber in deeper shadow. Outside the door, whispers multiplied, soft laughter drifting through corridors where scandal was currency and gossip the truest form of power. Caroline's words had escaped her lips like sparks, and now those sparks found eager kindling in the drawing rooms of London. The phrase, mad, bad, and dangerous to know, did not remain hers alone. It was repeated, embroidered, and savored until it became a refrain. Society, which thrives not on truth but on story, had found its latest tale, and Caroline stood at its center, her private torment turned to public spectacle. Gossip in Regency London was as swift as it was merciless. It began as murmured amusement among the well-born, then spread through servants and visitors until it became common knowledge. Caroline's infatuation with Byron was no longer the private passion of 2 restless souls. It was a performance witnessed by all, interpreted by many, judged by most. She'd been seen leaning too close at parties, heard laughing too freely, observed sending glances that betrayed too much. The secrecy that sustains forbidden love was gone, and in its place lay exposure, as harsh and unforgiving as daylight. Those who had once indulged her wit now shook their heads. Those who had once admired her vivacity now whispered of instability. She was not merely a woman in love, she was a woman undone, a woman defying the quiet boundaries within which her sex was meant to live. And though men were often excused for their passions, women were seldom forgiven. Caroline's recklessness was judged not as vitality but as vice, not as honesty but as madness. Byron himself, ever conscious of his reputation, grew uneasy. He had enjoyed the thrill of her passion, the flattery of her devotion, the amusement of her wit. But as the whispers grew louder, he saw danger, not to his soul, for he had long ceased to worry for that, but to his standing. He feared ridicule more than ruin, contempt more than censure. And Caroline, by her very openness, by her refusal to be hidden, threatened to make him ridiculous. The more visible her obsession, the colder his manner grew. He distanced himself with studied cruelty, mocking her in private, withdrawing in public, punishing her for the very love he had once invited. Caroline, however, could not retreat. The more he pulled away, the more she pursued, as if silence and coldness only deepened her need. She spoke of him openly, sometimes wildly, unable to restrain the outpouring of her passion. At assemblies she would appear restless, her eyes fixed upon the door, her voice rising in laughter that carried too far. When Byron did arrive, her presence betrayed all, her excitement unguarded, her remarks edged with either too much fondness or too much reproach. Each gathering became a stage upon which her obsession played out, to the delight of onlookers and the despair of her family. Society's appetite for scandal is insatiable. Those who condemned her most loudly were often the same who repeated her story with relish, savoring each new detail of her humiliation. Friends grew scarce, unwilling to be tainted by association. Her husband, patient as he was, found himself forced into silence, unable to protect her from herself. And Caroline, who had once moved through salons with the lightness of wit, now found herself walking through them as though through a gauntlet, her every gesture scrutinized, her every word twisted into rumor. One must wonder what thoughts filled her mind in those moments when she withdrew from the crowd and sat alone in her chamber, hearing the laughter through the walls. Did she regret her openness? Did she curse her own recklessness? Or did she, in defiance, believe that her love was greater than the world's judgment, that the purity of her passion outweighed the hypocrisy of society? Perhaps all these thoughts passed through her, for her letters show both despair and pride, shame and defiance. She knew she was being destroyed, and yet she would not yield. The image of whispered laughter is a cruel one, for laughter, when shared, can be joy, but when hidden, when directed at another, it becomes a knife. Caroline must have felt those knives pierce her with every whisper, every turned glance, every smile that concealed derision. She had once laughed too loudly herself, mocking convention, delighting in her own boldness. Now she was the one mocked, and her laughter had turned to tears. Yet still, she could not be silent, could not retreat, could not renounce the man who had already begun to ruin her. For Byron's cruelty grew more apparent. He began to treat her with disdain, to make her the subject of his wit, to humiliate her before others. Yet Caroline, wounded and humiliated, clung to him still. In his coldness she saw only proof of his power, in his rejection only confirmation of her own devotion. The paradox deepened. The more he wounded her, the more she loved him. The more she was humiliated, the more she pursued. It was as though the very scandal that destroyed her also bound her to him. In such moments one cannot help but ask, was this love at all? Or was it only obsession, a fever of the soul that mistook torment for passion? And yet, if love is measured not by serenity but by intensity, then surely Caroline's love was among the fiercest, for she gave not only her heart but her reputation, her dignity, her peace of mind. She laid them all upon the altar of Byron, and he, with characteristic disdain, accepted the offering without gratitude. The salons of London buzzed with the story, each whisper another thread in the web of scandal. Caroline's name and Byron's became inseparable, bound together in a narrative of passion and ruin. The more society laughed, the more she suffered. The more she suffered, the more she clung. Thus, gossip became not merely commentary but fuel, driving the story forward, pushing her further into desperation. And so the candle guttered, casting shadows upon the walls, the laughter outside fading into silence. In that silence, Caroline sat alone, her letters spread before her, her tears falling upon the ink, her heart torn between pride and despair. The city slept, but the whispers would rise again with the morning, for gossip never rests, and scandal never dies. The laughter fades, leaving only the hush of a room too still, too heavy with secrets. And in that hush, a new sound begins. The slow rustle of fabric torn suddenly, as though something fragile has given way. The sound of torn fabric lingers in the stillness, a sharp rip that echoes like the breaking of something unseen. It might have been the hem of a gown caught in haste, or a handkerchief pulled too tightly in trembling hands, yet it serves as a symbol of the rending of trust and tenderness. For as gossip thickened and laughter sharpened, Byron's cruelty began to show itself with increasing clarity, and Caroline's heart, already bruised, was left to bleed openly. What once was passion, bright and dangerous, became rejection, cold and deliberate, each slight another tear in the fabric of her spirit. Byron had never been a man of constancy, yet in the early days of their entanglement he had given her glimmers of warmth, enough to bind her hope. Now, as society grew restless with their scandal, he seemed to delight in displaying his indifference. Where once he answered her fervent letters with wit, he now ignored them, or replied with biting brevity. Where once he tolerated her reckless laughter, he now turned it into mockery. In gatherings, he could cut her down with a glance or a phrase, humiliating her before the very people who had been whispering about them for months. To love a man like Byron was to live in perpetual uncertainty. But now Caroline's uncertainty gave way to certainty of cruelty, a cruelty that pierced her as deeply as any blade. And yet, she did not withdraw. To those around her, her persistence seemed madness. Why cling to a man who mocked her? Why pursue a figure who treated her with disdain? But obsession has its own logic, one that thrives on rejection as much as on acceptance. Every cold word from Byron seemed to deepen Caroline's hunger. Every slight seemed to inflame her passion. It was as though the pain itself had become proof of her love, and humiliation the very substance of her devotion. For her, cruelty did not end desire. It intensified it, feeding the fire until it consumed what little dignity she still possessed. Society, watching, was merciless. The same drawing rooms that had once thrilled at her wit now delighted in her humiliation. Her public scenes, her visible despair, her inability to mask her feelings became the entertainment of the city. Caroline, once admired for her liveliness, became a cautionary tale whispered behind fans. Her beauty was still remarked upon, but now it was the beauty of a woman undone. Her eyes too bright, her laughter too wild, her manner too restless. She was no longer an ornament of society, but its spectacle. And Byron, with cold detachment, seemed to watch her unravel as though it were a play staged for his amusement. In the privacy of her home, the torment was greater still. Letters unanswered piled upon her desk, their silence heavier than words of reproach. She would sit for hours, waiting for a knock that never came, listening for a carriage that did not arrive. At times, in fury, she tore his letters, scattering fragments like torn fabric across the floor. At other times, she pressed them to her lips, weeping as though they were relics of a lost saint. Her husband, William, bore the sorrow quietly, offering patience where many would have offered anger. Yet even his gentleness could not rescue her from the storm into which she had thrown herself. The coldness of rejected passion is unlike any other pain. It is not the pain of absence alone, but of presence turned hostile, of intimacy turned to disdain. Caroline knew what it was to be loved by Byron, even if briefly, and thus she could not release the memory. Every cruel word reminded her of the tenderness that had preceded it, and every humiliation whispered of a love she believed could be restored. She lived in the shadow of possibility, convinced that if she loved him enough, suffered enough, pursued him enough, he would once again turn toward her with warmth. It was a hope as fragile as torn cloth, and yet she clung to it with all her strength. One wonders whether Byron understood the depth of her suffering, and whether he cared. His writings suggest that he saw her obsession as tiresome, her scenes as theatrical, her love as an inconvenience. Yet there are moments in his words that betray a hint of fascination, as though he could not fully turn away from the very intensity that repelled him. Perhaps, in her devotion, he saw a mirror of his own destructive nature, and in rejecting her, he was also rejecting something within himself. Or perhaps he simply enjoyed the cruelty, for Byron was not above taking pleasure in the ruin of others. The torn fabric remains an image of her state, a garment once whole, now ripped, still worn, but forever marked. Caroline could not conceal the damage. It showed in her eyes, in her voice, in her every gesture. At assemblies, when Byron mocked her with a quip or turned his back upon her, she would laugh too loudly, speak too rashly, attempt to mask her pain with a performance that only confirmed the whispers of madness. And when she returned home, she would collapse into tears, her spirit as ragged as the gown she might have torn in her anguish. It is here, in the cruelty of rejected passion, that her story takes on its deepest pathos. For Caroline was not a fool, nor was she blind. She knew Byron's disdain, she felt his coldness, she recognized the humiliation, yet she could not stop. Love had become obsession, obsession had become identity, and to release him would have been to release herself. Perhaps that was the truest danger of Byron, not that he ruined reputations, but that he drew souls so deeply into his orbit that they could no longer imagine existence without him. The torn fabric lies crumpled on the floor, a silent witness to the unraveling of dignity and the cruelty of indifference. And as Caroline lifts her head from her tear-stained hands, the sound of boots upon marble floors echoes from the distance, steady, measured, approaching with the inevitability of fate. The echo of boots upon marble floors advances with a rhythm both stately and unyielding, each step reverberating through the cold halls of grand houses where society gathered to watch itself. For Caroline, those measured footsteps carried dread and fascination alike. They belonged to Byron as he entered the salons with careless grace, or to the countless witnesses whose eyes turned at once upon her whenever his figure appeared. The polished stone reflected not only the sound of boots, but the clatter of expectation, the suspense of how she would behave, what scene she might enact, what wound she might expose in her restless desperation. Caroline could no longer keep her passion confined to private letters or quiet tears. Her love, twisted now into obsession, spilled into public view in ways both reckless and humiliating. At soirées and assemblies where others exchanged polite courtesies beneath glittering chandeliers, she became a spectacle of uncontrolled feeling. She would approach Byron with fervor, her voice rising above the murmur of conversation, her eyes too bright, her gestures too eager. At times she pleaded openly, at others she mocked him with bitterness, but in every instance her actions betrayed what society least forgave, a woman without restraint. These public humiliations, though shocking to her friends, seemed almost inevitable to her nature. For Caroline could not live in silence, nor could she mask her emotions with the practiced indifference of other women of her rank. She burned too brightly, and that brightness was not one that soothed, but one that scorched. Where discretion demanded quiet glances, she offered bold declarations. Where dignity required retreat, she pressed forward with defiance. Each act of recklessness deepened her disgrace, yet also bound her more tightly to Byron, for humiliation was as much a chain as passion. Byron himself responded with increasing cruelty. He mocked her before others, offered her indifference as though it were a gift, allowed his companions to laugh at her wildness. To him, her public displays were both tiresome and amusing, confirmation of her madness and proof of his power. Yet one suspects that even he, with all his disdain, was not immune to the strange intoxication of her devotion, for he did not wholly sever their connection. He lingered enough to torment her, to keep her hopes alive, to ensure that she remained within his shadow. Society's appetite for scandal grew more voracious with each passing week. Guests arrived at gatherings not only to dance or converse, but to watch Caroline's next eruption. Some pitied her, others laughed, but all were fascinated. Her presence guaranteed drama, and drama was what the salons secretly craved. To be the subject of gossip is to be both destroyed and immortalized, and Caroline, through her reckless performances, became the most talked-about woman in London. Yet what immortality she gained was bought at the price of dignity, for every laugh at her expense, every whisper behind her back, deepened her fall. Her family suffered too. William, her husband, bore his humiliation in silence, unwilling to condemn her, yet unable to protect her. His patience, once admired, now appeared weakness in the eyes of society. Her relatives urged her to withdraw, to compose herself, to remember her station. But Caroline, consumed by passion, could not. To withdraw was to accept defeat, and defeat was more intolerable than scandal. She seemed almost to embrace her ruin, as though her humiliation was itself a form of devotion, proof that her love surpassed all boundaries. In truth, there was something theatrical in her behavior. Caroline, who had always possessed a flair for drama, now acted her own tragedy upon the public stage. She seemed aware, at least dimly, that her passion had become performance, that her tears and laughter were witnessed and interpreted. Yet she could not stop, for performance and reality had become inseparable. To play the role of the ruined lover was no longer an act. It was her life, her identity, her fate. Madness and performance entwined so closely that one could no longer distinguish them, and perhaps she herself could not either. There is a cruelty in the way society watches such ruin. The very people who condemned her also prolonged her suffering by their attention. They claimed to scorn her but eagerly awaited her next scene. Their judgment was cloaked in moral disdain, yet beneath it lay fascination, even admiration, for her refusal to conform, her willingness to expose what others concealed. In mocking her, they were also drawn to her, for she embodied the passion they themselves feared to express. The echo of boots on marble floors thus becomes not only the sound of Byron's approach, but the rhythm of her own downfall, the steady march of scandal through the halls of her world. Each step brought her closer to humiliation, yet also closer to the immortality of legend. For though society laughed at her, it could not forget her. Caroline's passion, reckless and ruinous, etched itself into memory far more deeply than the quiet propriety of her peers. One may pause to wonder, did she know, even as she suffered, that her ruin would make her unforgettable? Did she sense that by sacrificing dignity, she was securing a strange kind of immortality? Or was she too lost in the immediacy of pain to imagine the future at all? Perhaps both were true. For passion can blind, but it can also grant a clarity beyond reason, a knowledge that intensity, even in destruction, endures. Her reckless displays grew bolder still. At one gathering, it is said, she collapsed in tears upon the floor, her sobs silencing the music. At another, she spoke of Byron with such vehemence that the room fell into embarrassed quiet. Each scene deepened her disgrace, yet each also drew her further into legend. Byron remained cold, society remained cruel, but Caroline remained herself, unrestrained, unashamed, consumed. And when at last the gatherings ended, when the candles were extinguished and the guests departed, Caroline would return to her chamber, her silks rumpled, her eyes swollen with tears. There she would sit in the silence, listening once more for the echo of boots on marble floors, as though each sound carried the promise of his return. The marble, cold and unyielding, reflected only her own footsteps, her own solitude. The echo lingers, then fades, leaving only stillness. And from that stillness comes the sudden slam of a door, a sound sharp and final, as though some boundary has been crossed that cannot be undone. The slammed door reverberates through the corridors, its echo lingering like a reprimand, as though the very house itself had turned against her. That sharp report marked more than the closing of wood upon hinges. It signified rejection, separation, the cutting off of hope. Doors had been closed to Caroline many times by now. Doors of society, doors of friendship, even doors of family council. But the most unbearable of all were the doors Byron himself slammed, whether literally or figuratively, each one a denial that left her standing in the cold corridor of humiliation. At parties, the tension grew unbearable. What once had been glances and whispers became eruptions, scenes that startled even those accustomed to scandal. Caroline, desperate for his presence, would seek him out amid the glittering crowd, her steps hurried, her voice rising above the hum of conversation. Byron, with his imperturbable indifference, would meet her approach with disdain, or worse, with laughter shared with companions at her expense. The cruelty of his mockery, delivered not in private, but before witnesses, stung more deeply than silence. And Caroline, unable to bear the humiliation, would respond with passion that erupted like a storm, leaving the gathering hushed, then murmuring, then buzzing with renewed gossip. There are stories of her confronting him in public, her voice sharp, her tears unrestrained. In one account, she is said to have rushed across a crowded room, her words spilling forth in a torrent of reproach, only to be met with Byron's cold reply that cut her into silence. In another, she is described as collapsing in despair when he turned away, her body trembling as others pretended not to look. Each scene deepened her disgrace, yet also bound her more tightly to him, for every humiliation was transformed in her mind into proof of love. If she suffered so greatly, it must mean that her love was true, and if her love was true, then surely it could not be wasted. But passion does not obey logic, and obsession least of all. Caroline's eruptions became part of her identity, the very performance that society expected of her. She was the woman who would create a scene, who would cry too loudly, who would speak of her ruin with unguarded candor. And though she despised the whispers, she also seemed unable to stop. For without these eruptions, she would have vanished into silence, and silence was the one thing she could not endure. To be forgotten was worse than to be mocked. To be ignored was worse than to be humiliated, and so she gave society what it craved, even as it destroyed her. Byron, for his part, responded with increasing detachment. He was a man skilled at withdrawing, at holding himself aloof, at treating passion as though it were a performance meant for his amusement. To Caroline's tears, he gave irony. To her accusations, he gave silence. To her devotion, he gave contempt, and yet he never fully released her, never severed the bond entirely. He lingered enough to keep her hope alive, enough to ensure her ruin would continue. Was it vanity, cruelty, or some darker fascination that kept him near? Perhaps all three. For Byron thrived on intensity, and Caroline provided it in abundance, even if only as a mirror for his own destructive allure. The slammed doors were not only literal, but symbolic of the world closing against her. Each time she confronted Byron, she found herself shut out of his heart, of his circle, of his regard. Yet still she returned, still she knocked, still she pressed forward. One must wonder whether she knew the futility of her efforts, whether she recognized that every confrontation only widened the gulf between them. But obsession blinds even the clearest mind, and Caroline's clarity had long since been blurred by the fever of passion. Society, ever hungry, watched with cruel delight. At first there had been pity, amusement at her recklessness, sorrow at her humiliation. But as her eruptions grew more frequent, pity hardened into scorn. She became not merely a figure of scandal, but of ridicule. Her name was spoken with laughter, her presence anticipated as one anticipates a spectacle. The same city that had once been her stage of charm now became her arena of torment. And through it all, Byron's indifference only sharpened the mockery, for his coldness seemed to justify the judgment of others. There is a certain tragedy in how the door closes upon a heart still open. Caroline's devotion, however wild, was genuine, and in that sincerity lay her ruin. She loved without measure, without restraint, without care for reputation or consequence. And society, which praised passion in poetry, condemned it in a woman's life. Had Byron written verses of such devotion, they would have been hailed as genius. But because Caroline lived them, she was mocked as mad. Thus the double standard of her age punished her not only for her passion, but for her honesty in expressing it. In the silence that follows the slammed door, one may imagine Caroline standing alone in a corridor dimly lit, her hands trembling, her breath unsteady. Behind the door lies Byron, perhaps laughing with companions, perhaps indifferent, perhaps already forgetting. Before her lies only the gaze of society, watching, whispering, judging. And she, caught between the closed door and the open stairs, finds herself trapped in a prison of her own making, a prison with no escape but further passion, further humiliation, further ruin. And yet, even in this state, she did not lose her spark of defiance. Caroline was not one to retreat meekly into silence. If Byron closed the door, she would knock louder. If society mocked her, she would mock herself more boldly, turning shame into theater. There was a kind of courage in her recklessness, a refusal to bow to convention even as it crushed her. In her wildness lay a strange dignity, the dignity of one who refuses to pretend, who chooses ruin rather than hypocrisy. It was this defiance, as much as her passion, that made her unforgettable. The slam of the door fades into the night, its echo still vibrating in the air. Caroline, pale and trembling, gathers her shawl about her shoulders and steps away, her figure retreating into the shadows of the corridor. Outside, the night is still, the sky heavy with clouds. The silence deepens until it is broken only by the distant hush of winter wind, carrying with it the promise of a colder silence yet to come. The winter silence settled like a heavy cloak upon the city, muffling the carriages that passed along snow-dusted streets and dimming the laughter that spilled from windows lit with yellow glow. Within this hushed season came news that struck Caroline like a blade. Byron had married. The poet whose indifference had already pierced her, whose cruelty had already humiliated her, now sealed himself to another with vows spoken before God and society. To many, it was a predictable turn, for Byron's restlessness needed the appearance of respectability. But to Caroline, it was devastation, the final proof that the door once slammed upon her heart would never again open. The marriage of Byron to Annabella Milbank was not merely a personal betrayal, it was a public spectacle. Annabella, with her reputation for virtue and her calm intelligence, seemed everything that Caroline was not. Where Caroline was reckless, Annabella was composed. Where Caroline was wild, Annabella was measured. To society, the match offered the hope of Byron's reformation, as though the dangerous poet might be tamed by a wife of unimpeachable character. To Caroline, the marriage was a poison she could not purge, the cruelest humiliation of all. For she had given herself entirely, without restraint, and now saw herself replaced by a woman who embodied the very propriety she had scorned. Jealousy is a poison that seeps slowly, yet once within the veins, it spreads without mercy. Caroline's jealousy was not only of Annabella's position, but of the image she represented: the wife, the respectable lady, the woman accepted by society. Caroline had never sought to be proper, yet in seeing another possess Byron under the guise of propriety, she felt the sharpness of her own exclusion. Her passion had made her infamous. Annabella's restraint had made her honored. It was as though the world itself declared that Caroline's love was not love at all, but madness, while Annabella's quiet claim was rewarded with vows and legitimacy. The torment of jealousy did not pass quietly. Caroline spoke of it openly, her bitterness pouring forth in words that shocked her companions. She railed against Byron, against Annabella, against the hypocrisy of a society that praised virtue yet hungered for scandal. At times she wept. At times she laughed with a wildness that unsettled even those accustomed to her unpredictability. Her despair was not confined to the privacy of her chamber. It spilled into gatherings, into letters, into every corner of her life. The poison of jealousy did not remain hidden. It coursed visibly through her, altering her very presence. Byron, meanwhile, treated her jealousy with the same coldness he had shown her devotion. He mocked her grief, dismissed her outbursts, and, in his darker moods, seemed almost to relish her suffering. For him, her obsession had long since ceased to be passion. It was annoyance, a weight, a shadow he wished to cast off. Yet even as he turned from her, he could not erase her from his legend, for Caroline's words, her scenes, her very ruin, clung to him as much as his cruelty clung to her. In marrying Annabella, he sought respectability, yet his name was already tied to Caroline's in a bond of scandal that no ceremony could undo. It is here that one sees the true cruelty of jealousy. It is not only the fear of loss, but the certainty of replacement. Caroline was not merely abandoned, she was supplanted. To imagine Byron's hand resting in another's, his voice softened for another's ear, his words of tenderness offered to another's heart, was torment beyond endurance. And yet she could not stop imagining it, for jealousy feeds upon itself, creating visions sharper than reality. Each thought was a wound, and each wound drew her deeper into despair. The winter silence outside mirrored the silence within her home. William, patient still, bore his wife's anguish as quietly as he could, yet the gulf between them widened. Caroline's grief was too consuming to allow for reconciliation, too wild to be soothed by his gentleness. She did not seek comfort in his steadiness. She rejected it, for it could not compare to the fire of the man she had lost. Thus her marriage, already strained, suffered further, another casualty of her obsession. In her solitude, Caroline returned to her writing, pouring her torment into words once more. Yet even in literature, her jealousy surfaced, sharp and unyielding. Characters resembling Byron and Annabella appeared thinly disguised in her novels, their virtues and vices laid bare through the lens of her bitterness. To write was to wound, yet also to confess, for in her fiction she revealed the depth of her anguish. Readers, both then and now, found in her writings the rawness of truth, the unvarnished confession of a heart consumed. But society, ever cruel, saw in them only confirmation of her madness, another performance in the tragedy she enacted. Jealousy, like winter, freezes and isolates. Caroline, once the bright and restless wit of the salons, grew more solitary, more erratic. Her friends withdrew, her family despaired, and society judged. Yet in her isolation she remained defiant, refusing to retreat into silence. She spoke still of Byron, even when to do so invited ridicule. She confessed still her love, even when it was met with laughter. She allowed jealousy to shape her, even when it destroyed her. For to deny her jealousy would have been to deny her passion, and Caroline could not live without passion, however poisonous. The image of a winter night, silent and heavy, captures her state. Outside, the snow falls gently, covering the city in a blanket of calm. Inside, Caroline paces her chamber, her hands clenched, her face pale, her mind filled with visions of Byron's marriage bed. The contrast is cruel, the world hushed in purity, her soul writhing in torment. And yet, within that torment, there is also a strange beauty. For in suffering so openly, she revealed the raw truth of love's destructive power. She became what others feared to be, a woman undone by passion, unashamed to display her ruin. The winter silence lingers, heavy and unbroken. Then, within that silence, the faintest sound arises, the slow scratching of a quill upon paper. Caroline, unable to speak her anguish aloud, bends once more to write, her words spilling forth as tears. Each line is both confession and accusation, both plea and curse. The scratching grows louder in the stillness, the sound of ink carving grief into permanence. The quill scratches against the paper, a restless sound in the quiet of her chamber, as though the feather itself were agitated by her torment. The ink stains spread unevenly, betraying the tremor in her hand, the hurried pressure of her need to release what her voice could no longer bear. These lines were not merely letters to Byron, nor were they drafts of novels yet to come. They were confessions written into the void, attempts to pour grief into words that might lighten its weight, though the act of writing seemed only to deepen the wound. Each word was a mirror of her unraveling, each page a testament to decline. Caroline's health, already fragile, began to falter beneath the weight of passion and humiliation. Sleepless nights hollowed her cheeks, restless pacing weakened her body, and the ceaseless storms of emotion drained her vitality. Friends who once described her beauty in terms of brightness and fire now remarked upon her pallor, her unsteady gait, the haunted look in her eyes. Her voice, once quick with wit, carried now a fevered edge, as if every word cost her strength. She was still young in years, yet already she bore the weariness of one aged by suffering. The slow punishment of society was harsher still than the decline of her body. For society punishes not with sudden blows, but with gradual exclusion, with whispers that grow into silence, with doors that remain closed. Invitations dwindled, visits grew infrequent, and those who once sought her company now turned away. She, who had once delighted in gatherings, found herself unwelcomed. A figure too scandalous, too unstable, too dangerous to the fragile balance of respectability. The salons where she had laughed, the ballrooms where she had danced, the gardens where she had whispered, these spaces closed around her like a world shrinking, leaving her isolated in her own house, in her own restless mind. It is cruel to observe how quickly society can turn. The same mouths that once repeated her witty remarks now repeated her humiliations. The same ears that once listened eagerly to her laughter now refused to hear her cries. In public, she was judged harshly. In private, she was pitied, but pity seldom carried with it compassion. To be pitied is to be diminished, to be placed at a distance, observed as a warning rather than embraced as a friend. Caroline felt the sting of pity almost as sharply as the sting of mockery, for both confirmed her ruin. Her husband, William, remained by her side with a patience that astonished many. He did not condemn her, nor did he cast her away, though her behavior had wounded him deeply. His gentleness was a quiet constant amid the storm, and yet it was a gentleness she could not accept. For Caroline did not want steadiness. She craved fire, and William's quiet devotion could not match the flames of her obsession. Perhaps, in another life, his patience might have been balm to her restless spirit, but in this one, it was only a reminder of what she could not desire. Thus even his compassion was a sorrow, a reminder of the love she had rejected for a love that destroyed her. As her health weakened and her reputation faded, Caroline clung still to writing. Her quill became her companion, the scratching upon paper, the rhythm of her days. She wrote of passion, of betrayal, of ruin. She wrote of Byron in guises thinly veiled, casting him as hero, as villain, as both. She wrote herself into her characters, exposing her wounds to readers who recognized the truth beneath the fiction. In her novels, she sought not only revenge but confession, as though by telling her story in another's name, she might purge herself of grief. Yet the effect was double-edged, for while her writing gave her voice, it also confirmed her scandal. Critics mocked, readers gossiped, society judged anew. What she hoped might save her became another chain binding her to ruin. Her decline was not swift but gradual, the slow unraveling of spirit and body together. She suffered bouts of fever, fits of agitation, moments of collapse. Physicians prescribed rest, quiet, remedies that could not touch the root of her torment. Friends urged withdrawal, prayer, acceptance, but Caroline could not retreat into silence. She remained restless, defiant, her spirit unwilling to bow even as her body faltered. There was in her decline a strange dignity, for she refused to mask her suffering, refused to pretend. She lived her ruin openly, and in that openness lay a kind of truth that society could not tolerate. It is here, in the image of a woman declining under the weight of her passion, that her tragedy deepens. For Caroline's love was not only her undoing, it was also her vitality. Without it, she would have been another lady of her rank, admired briefly, then forgotten. With it, she became unforgettable, but at the cost of peace, of health, of reputation. The very intensity that made her remarkable also consumed her, leaving behind only fragments, letters torn, whispers cruel, pages stained with ink and tears. The scratching of the quill grows softer, as though her strength is failing. The ink runs dry at times, forcing her to pause, to dip again, to continue with trembling hand. The page fills slowly, each line less steady than the last. Outside, the winter silence deepens, the snow falling steadily upon the city, muffling even the sound of carriages. Inside, only the quill moves, its scratching like the faint heartbeat of a woman whose own heart is breaking. And then, at last, the scratching stops. The quill rests upon the paper, its tip dark with ink, its work unfinished. The silence within the room is heavy, as though even the air waits. In that silence, one hears not the voice of society, nor the mockery of gossip, but only the faint sound of ink drying upon the page, fading slowly into stillness. The quill that had fallen silent is lifted once more, its nib scratching again against paper, the faint rasping sound like the murmur of breath in a sick room. Caroline bends to her work, not with the secrecy of a lover composing letters in haste, but with the determination of an author shaping her confession into permanence. These pages are not hidden in drawers, but destined for the wider world, where they will be read, judged, mocked, and remembered. In her novels, she transfigured her passion, her jealousy, her ruin, into fiction thinly veiled, so thin that all who read could see Byron in her heroes, Byron in her villains, Byron in every shadow cast across the stage of her imagination. Her first novel, Glenarvan, caused a sensation, though not the kind that restored dignity. Published anonymously in 1816, the book was at once a confession and an act of revenge. Its central figure, a dark and alluring seducer named Glenarvan, was so transparent a portrait of Byron that even those with only passing acquaintance recognized him. The character was drawn with both fascination and bitterness, embodying the poet's charm and cruelty, his genius and his destruction. Caroline poured into the book her love and her hatred, her longing and her scorn, her memories distorted into fiction, yet sharpened by the truth they contained. The society that had condemned her now seized upon her novel with equal fervor. Some read it as entertainment, delighting in the scandal of its thin disguises. Others condemned it as vulgar, a betrayal of confidence, a disgrace to her name. Byron himself, though he scoffed, must have felt the sting, for to see one's image laid bare in fiction is to be wounded more deeply than by rumor. Caroline had turned their affair into literature, and in doing so, she ensured it would never be forgotten. Yet the act of writing was not only revenge, it was also confession. Caroline's heroines, trembling between passion and ruin, were shadows of herself, their words echoes of her own letters, their fates mirrors of her own despair. To read her novels is to glimpse her inner torment, her attempts to make sense of what had consumed her. She sought, perhaps, to transform her scandal into art, to claim authority over her story by telling it herself. But the line between art and exposure was too thin, and society, eager for gossip, read her novels not as works of imagination, but as revelations of her shame. The ink well upon her desk grew shallow, its darkness reflecting the exhaustion of her spirit. Still she dipped the quill, still she wrote, unable to stop. Writing had become her last refuge, the only means by which she could speak without interruption, without mockery. On paper, at least, her voice was heard in full, unbroken by Byron's scorn or society's laughter. On paper, she could confess without restraint, rage without consequence, love without rejection. Yet even here the act did not free her, it bound her further. For each page written was another chain to the memory of Byron, another monument to the passion she could not escape. Critics and readers alike responded with fascination mixed with disdain. Some praised her courage, her rawness, her willingness to expose what others concealed. Others sneered at her lack of propriety, her shamelessness, her madness. The book was spoken of in the same breath as her scandals, not as art, but as evidence of her ruin. She had hoped, perhaps, to reclaim her story. Instead, she only deepened her infamy. Yet in doing so, she also secured her place in memory, for scandal fades quickly, but written words endure. Her later writings followed the same path, confession veiled as fiction, passion turned into narrative. Each work was less successful than the last, for society's appetite for her story waned as her novelty faded. But she continued to write, compelled not by the hope of acclaim, but by the necessity of expression. To stop writing would have been to surrender entirely to silence, and silence was the one fate she could not bear. Her quill became both her torment and her salvation, the tool by which she preserved herself even as she destroyed herself further. There is a poignancy in imagining her at her desk, pale and weary, her fingers stained with ink, her candle burning low. Outside, the world moved on, indifferent to her suffering. Inside, she bent over her pages, carving her grief into permanence. She was at once creator and victim, artist and confessor, her novels both weapons and wounds. And though society mocked, one cannot deny the courage of her act. For in writing, she refused to be silenced, refused to allow her story to be told only by others. She may have been ruined, but she would not be forgotten. The ink well, however, could not last forever. Its dark pool grew shallower with each line, its rim stained with the evidence of countless dips. At last, as her hand trembled over the page, the quill scratched dry, leaving faint marks without substance. Caroline stared at the empty well, its depth exhausted, its silence mirroring her own. The act of writing had drained not only the ink, but her spirit, leaving her once again in silence. She set the quill aside, her hands ink-stained, her face weary. The pages before her lay heavy with words, yet still they could not capture all that she felt. Nothing could, for passion is greater than language, and obsession cannot be contained in ink. She leaned back, her eyes fixed upon the empty well, as though it were a symbol of her own heart, once brimming, now dry, once full of fire, now hollow. The silence of the room deepened, broken only by the faint drip of wax from the candle. The ink well stood empty, a small vessel incapable of holding the vastness of her grief. And as Caroline gazed upon it, she seemed to hear the faint rustle of paper, a single page slipping loose, falling gently to the floor, as though carrying her story downward into obscurity. The page drifts downward, curling as it falls, and settles softly upon the floor, its white surface turned dim in the candlelight. That single page lying apart from the rest seems almost symbolic, a fragment cast away, an image of how Caroline's words, once loosed from her hand, fell into the world to be judged, mocked, and endlessly repeated. For her novels, which she had hoped might serve as veiled confessions or acts of reclamation, became themselves the source of scandal. Their pages scattered through society like leaves carried by an unforgiving wind. Glenarvan, her first and most infamous work, had already branded her. The later novels, Graham Hamilton, Ada Reese, continued to bear the same unmistakable mark, stories where the thin fabric of fiction scarcely concealed the outlines of her own life. Readers did not approach them as art. They approached them as revelations, eager to decipher the portraits, to point to Byron here, to Caroline there, to Annabella somewhere between. Literature became gossip in another form, another ballroom where whispers traveled swiftly, another drawing room where names were spoken through the safety of pseudonyms. The distinction between fiction and confession blurred until no one cared which it was, for the pleasure lay in the scandal itself. Caroline's books were judged not by their artistry, but by their indiscretion. Critics spoke of them with disdain as though they were vulgar exhibitions of private matters. Yet the same critics could not resist reading them, could not resist commenting upon them, could not resist being drawn once more into the story of the woman whose passion had shocked London. In condemning her, they ensured she remained in view. In mocking her, they confirmed her importance. Scandal feeds upon the very disdain that condemns it. And Caroline, whether she wished it or not, remained bound to the scandal of her own making. Her novels did more than recount her passion. They revealed her bitterness, her jealousy, her desire to wound as much as to confess. Glenarvan, the thinly disguised Byron, was not only alluring but treacherous, a man of genius whose cruelty destroyed all who loved him. Readers saw in him the poet himself, stripped of glamour, revealed as villain. Caroline, in writing him so, sought to reclaim some power, to expose what she had suffered. Yet in doing so, she also exposed herself, for the heroine who adored him bore too close a resemblance to Caroline herself. The novel, intended as both confession and revenge, betrayed its author even more than its subject. The scandal that followed was merciless. Families whispered of her disgrace. Friends recoiled from her boldness. Even William, patient still, could not protect her from the censure. The book was condemned as shameless, as madness written into print. Yet copies sold, readers lingered, whispers grew louder. Caroline had become once more the talk of society, but always as the figure of ruin, the woman who could not restrain her pen any more than her heart. She had given her story to the world, and the world turned it into entertainment. The single page upon the floor seems to capture this paradox. Words that fall away from their author, words no longer under her control, words that become part of the judgment of others. Caroline, who had hoped through writing to shape her own narrative, found herself instead further entangled in scandal. The more she wrote, the more her story was told not as she wished, but as others interpreted. Fiction became confession. Confession became evidence. Evidence became condemnation. And yet, she could not stop. For writing was her only voice, her only means of bearing the torment that otherwise consumed her. There is in this an image of futility that deepens her tragedy. Each page she wrote was both salvation and ruin. Salvation, for it allowed her to speak. Ruin, for it ensured society would mock her all the more. To stop writing was impossible. To continue writing was destruction. She was trapped in a cycle that mirrored her love for Byron. The very act that gave her life also destroyed her. As in passion, so in literature, she was bound to a paradox that could not be resolved. Her later novels received little kindness. Critics dismissed them as overwrought, as the products of a disordered mind. Readers lost interest once the initial scandal had faded. Yet for Caroline, they remained vital, for they were her only outlet, her only way to remain alive in memory. The act of writing itself became more important than the reception, for it was in writing that she could confront the ghosts of her love, even if the world would not forgive her for it. The page on the floor lies still, unclaimed, as though it has slipped beyond her grasp. One might imagine her gazing at it, too weary to stoop, too aware of its futility. A single page among many, yet once loosed, it could travel farther than she intended, carrying her shame into the hands of strangers. And so it was with all her words, once set free, never to be reclaimed. They drifted through society, torn from context, seized upon by gossips, turned against her in whispers and laughter. What had begun as confession ended as spectacle. Was it madness to have written so openly? Or was it courage to refuse silence even at the cost of ruin? The answer may never be clear. What is certain is that Caroline could not have done otherwise. She was too restless, too defiant, too unwilling to be quiet. Her words, like her passion, refused to remain hidden. And though they condemned her, they also preserved her, for without them she would long ago have vanished from memory. It is through those scandalous novels, those confessions veiled and unveiled, that her voice still reaches us, trembling yet unbroken. The candle flickers again, casting shadows across the fallen page. The room is hushed, heavy with silence, save for the faint toll of a distant bell, a sound carried through the cold night air, reminding her of the world beyond her chamber, the world from which she had been cast out. The faint toll of the bell carries through the air, a low and solemn sound that seems to mark not only the passing of the hour, but the passing of companionship. Caroline hears it in her solitude, a reminder that the world beyond her walls continues without her, that life in salons and assemblies still moves with its familiar rhythm while she remains apart. The bell does not call her to gather, nor summon her to prayer, nor welcome her into fellowship. It tolls instead like a distant voice, declaring her separation, her estrangement from the very circles that once embraced her. The estrangement began gradually like frost creeping over glass, but by now it had covered every surface. Friends who had once delighted in her wit withdrew, weary of her scandal, frightened of her volatility. Family members, though bound by blood, offered only reproach or silence. Even her marriage, which had withstood much, grew more hollow. William retreating into his patience, his sorrow, his public duties, while Caroline's restless spirit refused to be soothed. She became increasingly isolated, her presence unwelcome in the gatherings where once she had shone too brightly. The houses that had echoed with her laughter now closed their doors. The carriages that once stopped to collect her now passed by without pause. This isolation was both wound and refuge. It wounded her because she craved society, thrived upon the presence of others, longed for conversation, admiration, and connection. To be shut out was to be starved. Yet it was also refuge, for society had become cruel, its whispers knives, its laughter poison. To remain within her own chamber was at least to escape the immediate sting of mockery, to shut out the eyes that judged. Thus her solitude was both torment and shelter, both punishment and relief. She walked the rooms of her house as though in exile, pacing from one silence to another, hearing only the echo of her own footsteps. In such solitude, the mind turns inward, and the ghosts of memory grow more vivid. Caroline could not escape the images of Byron, his face, his voice, his cruel laughter, his tender phrases that still lingered though long past. In the absence of society, he became her constant companion, haunting her thoughts, filling her dreams. She spoke of him still, even when no one was there to listen. She wrote of him still, even when her pages fell unread. Isolation did not free her from obsession. It only deepened it. For without distraction, she was left alone with the figure of her ruin. Her estrangement from family cut deepest of all. The Ponsonbys, her kin of high standing, could not forgive the scandal she had brought upon their name. Her mother's reproach was sharp, her siblings distant. William's family, too, though tolerant, regarded her with sorrowing disdain. To be cut off from kinship was to lose not only support, but identity. For in that world, a woman's place was bound to her family's honor. Caroline had severed that bond with her recklessness, and now she bore the weight of their rejection. Yet she did not bow to their censure. She mocked it, defied it, even as it left her desolate. There is a cruel paradox in this. The very qualities that once made her beloved, her wit, her vivacity, her boldness, were the same that, when turned toward scandal, made her infamous. Society could not forgive in a woman what it admired in a man. Byron, with all his cruelties, continued to dazzle, continued to be read, admired, discussed. Caroline, with her equal intensity, was cast out. She became a cautionary tale, a warning to others of the danger of unrestrained passion. Yet in her solitude she remained defiantly herself, unwilling to conform, unwilling to apologize, unwilling to silence the very voice that had ruined her. One imagines her wandering the halls of her house, her footsteps muffled on carpets worn with pacing, her hands trailing along the walls as though searching for some boundary to push against. The windows looked out onto gardens now bare in winter, their branches stark against the gray sky. The rooms, once filled with conversation, echoed only with her murmurs, her fragments of song, her sudden laughter that startled even herself. She was alone, yet not silent, for silence was the one state she could not endure. Even in solitude she performed, her gestures grand before invisible audiences, her words spilling into the air as though to an unseen court. In these moments of estrangement, Caroline's story acquires a strange dignity, for though abandoned, she did not surrender. She turned her isolation into a stage of its own, where she enacted her passion, her despair, her defiance. She would not be silenced, even if the world refused to hear. Her writings, her words, her very presence remained loud, unruly, impossible to ignore. And though society condemned her, it could not erase her, for every act of defiance left another mark, another memory. The toll of the bell outside continues, marking time she cannot measure. Days blur into nights, nights into days, each alike in solitude, each filled with the same restless pacing, the same murmured recollections, the same letters half-written and abandoned. Time itself seems to lose meaning, for without society, without companionship, without love, what does the calendar signify? She lives not by the clock, but by the rhythm of her obsession, the rising and falling of memory, the waves of jealousy, the floods of despair. The bell tolls, but it tolls only as reminder of her estrangement, not as measure of her life. And yet, within the quiet of her isolation, she may have found moments of strange clarity. Estrangement strips away the pretenses of society, the masks worn in company. Alone, she could be honest, even if honesty meant madness. Alone, she could speak without fear, even if only to herself. Alone, she could admit the truth that passion had both exalted and destroyed her. Her solitude was heavy, but it was also pure, untouched by hypocrisy, unfiltered by propriety. In that purity lies a reflection of the woman she truly was, restless, defiant, consumed, and unforgettable. The bell toll fades, its echo carried away by the wind, leaving the night in stillness once more. Caroline sits by the window, her gaze fixed upon the empty street, her face pale in the moonlight. The house is silent, the world outside indifferent, and she remains within, estranged from all but her own thoughts. In that silence, she hears not the voices of friends nor the laughter of salons, but only the distant toll of her own heart, beating still, restless still, unwilling still to yield. And then, into that silence, comes another sound, the soft toll of a distant church bell, carried faintly through the night, as though echoing the one before, but farther away, fainter, more solemn, a reminder that time moves on, even when one is forgotten. The bell fades into the night air, each vibration weaker, more remote, until it is swallowed by silence. In that silence, Caroline's later years unfold like a long twilight, her once bright brilliance dimmed by frailty, her spirit still restless, but her body too weary to follow where passion urged. Illness came often now, fevers and chills, bouts of trembling that left her confined to her chamber for days at a time. Physicians attended her, prescribing quiet and restraint, as though she were a wayward child, but no draught or counsel could ease the deeper fever of her mind. Her brilliance, once quick with wit and fire, became erratic, broken by sudden fits of despair, sudden bursts of laughter that startled those around her. Frailty and wildness lived together in her body, wearing her down as steadily as the years. Society, which had once condemned her, now largely ignored her. The great scandal of her passion was no longer fresh, and newer scandals had arisen to take its place. But her name still carried its weight, still whispered as warning, still remembered with a mixture of amusement and sorrow. In gatherings where once she had danced, her absence was noted only in passing, her story retold not with pity, but with distance, as though she were already more legend than woman. To be forgotten by society would have been relief, but to be remembered only as scandal was a cruelty she bore in silence. Her home became both prison and sanctuary. Some days she wandered its rooms with restless steps, muttering fragments of verse, her eyes bright with fever. Other days she remained still for hours, staring at the fire or gazing through the window, as though searching for something in the distance. Visitors, fewer now, found her unpredictable. At times she welcomed them with warmth, her wit flashing with the brilliance of former days, making them forget for a moment her ruin. At other times she was erratic, speaking of Byron without restraint, recalling memories as though they had happened yesterday, her voice trembling between laughter and tears. To be with her was to walk upon uncertain ground, never knowing what storm might break, what silence might fall. Her health, her reputation, her friendships, each had declined, but still she held to defiance. Caroline did not retreat meekly into obscurity. She lived her ruin openly with the same wildness that had defined her passion. She did not seek to mend her reputation, nor to feign the serenity society expected of fallen women. Instead, she remained restless, proud even in frailty, unwilling to pretend. There was a strange dignity in her refusal, though it cost her dearly, for dignity in the eyes of her world was measured by silence and submission, and Caroline offered neither. William, ever patient, remained near, though their marriage had long been overshadowed by her obsession. He tended to her in her illnesses, bore her wildness with quiet endurance, shielded her as best he could from the harsher judgments of society. Yet he too grew weary, for her torments were endless, her passion inexhaustible, even as her strength failed. His patience was a balm, yet it could not heal her, for Caroline did not want to be healed of what had destroyed her. Her love, her ruin, her obsession, they were her very identity. To part with them would have been to part with herself. There is something haunting in the image of her in these years, a woman once radiant, now frail, a voice once lively, now trembling, a spirit once admired, now pitied. Yet even in frailty she remained vivid. Visitors who saw her in her decline remembered not her weakness but her intensity, the way her eyes still shone with restless fire, the way her words still carried the sharpness of wit. She was diminished, yet never dull. Even sickness could not quench the brightness of her presence, though it flickered like a lamp nearing its end. Her erratic behavior grew more pronounced. At times she spoke as though Byron were still alive, as though their affair continued, her mind looping back into the past with such clarity that it unsettled those who listened. At other times she cursed his name, calling him villain, betrayer, destroyer. Then, without warning, she would fall silent, her head bowed, her eyes brimming with tears, whispering words of love too faint to be heard. Madness and lucidity alternated like day and night, leaving her companions uncertain which face they would meet. But in both, the figure of Byron remained central, the axis around which her mind still turned. Society, hearing of her decline, took her as a moral lesson. She became the example whispered to daughters, the fate of passion unchecked, the ruin of defiance, the punishment of scandal. Yet such judgments missed the truth. For Caroline's decline was not mere punishment. It was the natural consequence of a love lived too openly, too fiercely, in a world that demanded concealment. She was not ruined by passion alone, but by the refusal of her age to accept passion in a woman as anything but madness. In another time, perhaps, she might have been seen as courageous, as honest, as true. In her own, she was condemned. Outside, the seasons turned. Spring came with blossoms, summer with warmth, autumn with falling leaves, winter with silence. Within her chamber, Caroline endured them all, the years passing as though she were already apart from time. Her body weakened, her spirit burned, her name lingered in whispers. She was both present and absent, both alive and already fading into legend. And one evening, as rain tapped softly against the window, she sat by the glass, her hand resting upon the pane. The drops slid downward like tears, tracing paths that blurred the world beyond. She watched them in silence, her reflection dim in the wet glass, her eyes following the rivulets as though seeking meaning in their descent. The rain fell steadily, each drop a reminder of passing time, each sound a measure of solitude. And in that quiet moment, frailty and brilliance met, her body failing, her spirit still restless, her heart still chained to the passion that had undone her. The rain continued, gentle yet insistent, filling the silence with its ceaseless murmur, as though the sky itself wept for her. The rain traced its silver threads down the glass, each droplet falling into another until the pane seemed veiled in water. Caroline leaned closer, her forehead almost against the chill, her breath misting faintly upon the window. The sound of the rain was soothing at first, a steady rhythm that might lull others into calm, but for her it was only another echo of restlessness. The murmuring of the storm outside blended with the murmuring within her mind, voices that never ceased, memories that returned again and again until they became indistinguishable from the present. Her madness, if one can call it that, did not arrive suddenly but crept, like the rain upon glass, drop by drop, until the view beyond was obscured. At times she was lucid, speaking with wit and intelligence that reminded all of her former brilliance. But at other times, her thoughts grew tangled, her words disjointed, her grasp upon reality loosened. She would speak of Byron as though he were in the next room, call for him in the night, or imagine his voice answering hers. Visitors who came to see her were unsettled, for she seemed to inhabit two worlds, the world of memory and the world of the present, and her mind slipped between them without warning. It is tempting to say that love destroyed her, yet one might also wonder if it was the loss of love that undid her more completely. Had Byron remained close, perhaps his cruelty would still have driven her toward ruin, yet at least she would have felt the fire still alive. In his absence, she was left only with ashes, and from those ashes rose the specter of obsession, filling her days with shadows she could not banish. To be haunted by memory is a torment greater than to be wounded by presence, for memory does not change, does not relent, does not allow for reconciliation. Byron in her mind was always the same, at once the cruel lover, the lost beloved, the genius, the destroyer. She could neither forgive nor forget, and so her soul remained chained to a ghost. Her madness deepened as her body weakened. She would pace her rooms in agitation, speaking aloud to no one, or sit for hours in silence, staring at nothing. At times she burst into wild laughter, startling those nearby. At others she wept uncontrollably, her sobs echoing through the house. Her family despaired, her husband grieved, her friends avoided her. Yet even in her disorder there was something magnetic, something that drew the eye. For she lived her passion openly, refusing the mask of composure that others wore. Madness may have consumed her, but it did not make her dull. She remained vivid, unforgettable, a figure of fascination even in ruin. The rain outside became a mirror of her mind, shifting from gentle patter to sudden torrent, from quiet mist to fierce downpour. She seemed to hear in it voices, fragments of poetry, echoes of conversations long past. The storm outside and the storm within became one, indistinguishable. To watch her at the window, her face pale against the glass, was to see a woman lost not in silence, but in a world of noise too vast for words. There are accounts of her breaking mirrors in these years, unable to bear her own reflection. Once celebrated for her beauty, she now saw in the glass a face lined with suffering, eyes too bright with fever, lips trembling with unspoken words. The mirror showed her not only her decline, but the absence of Byron beside her, the absence of the love that had defined her. To shatter the glass was to shatter the image, yet the fragment still reflected her, distorted, multiplied, impossible to escape. In those shards she saw herself ruined, divided, scattered. And perhaps she also saw Byron still, his figure lingering in her memory as vividly as her own reflection. The broken mirror became a symbol of her state, beauty destroyed, identity fragmented, memory unyielding. Each shard was sharp, each fragment dangerous, yet together they still formed the image of who she had been. Caroline herself was like that mirror, broken, yet still reflecting, still catching light even in ruin. Madness had not erased her. It had only divided her into pieces too many to hold together. Her husband William bore her decline with sorrow, his patience tested yet unbroken. He arranged care, sought physicians, shielded her as best he could from public judgment, but he could not shield her from herself. The storms of her mind could not be calmed by medicine, nor by reason, nor by love unreturned. Her family, estranged and weary, offered little comfort. She was left largely to herself, alone with her memories, her writings, her restless pacing. Isolation and madness entwined until they became inseparable. And yet, amid the brokenness, there were still flashes of brilliance. She continued to write, though her words grew more erratic, more fevered. She spoke at times with astonishing clarity, piercing through her own confusion with insights sharp as ever. Those who heard her in such moments could not dismiss her entirely as mad. She was too intelligent, too vivid, too true. Her madness was not the absence of mind, but its excess, overflowing into channels it could no longer contain. The rain against the window ceased at last, leaving streaks upon the glass like scars. Caroline turned from it to face the room, her gaze falling upon the shattered mirror on the floor. She stepped toward it slowly, her reflection multiplied into fragments, each one showing her from a different angle, each one incomplete. She knelt, her fingers hovering above the shards, her breath shallow. The broken mirror seemed to speak to her, not in words but in images. Her past, her passion, her ruin, all reflected in pieces. And in that moment one cannot help but wonder, was it truly love that destroyed her, or was it the absence of it? Was it Byron's cruelty or society's scorn, or her own unyielding nature? The mirror offers no answer, only reflections, each fragment telling a different truth. Caroline herself may not have known, for madness blurs certainty. But the question lingers still, sharp as the broken glass at her feet. The candlelight trembled upon the shards, casting flickers of brightness across the room. The broken mirror lay silent, its pieces gleaming faintly, each one a small echo of the woman kneeling before it. The fragments of glass lay scattered across the floor, tiny prisms catching the candlelight, each shard a sliver of memory, each glimmer a fragment of the woman she had once been. Caroline's hand hovered above them, her fingers trembling as though afraid to touch, afraid of the cuts that might follow. Yet in the scattered pieces she saw not only herself, but the shadow of Byron, lingering still, as though his figure were reflected alongside her own in every fragment. Memory was her constant companion now, torment and sanctuary alike, binding her to a past that would not release her. Her days had grown quieter, though not calmer. The frenzy of society, the salons and the laughter, the cruel whispers and public humiliations had receded into distance. Yet within her mind the story still played on, endlessly repeating scenes of love and rejection, tenderness and cruelty. She spoke of Byron often, sometimes with anger, sometimes with longing, sometimes with a wistful tenderness that startled those who heard. She could not release him, though years had passed, though he had gone on to other lives, other loves, other ruins of his own. To her he remained ever present, a shadow moving through her rooms, a voice answering her in silence. It was not only Byron the man she clung to, but Byron the figure of her imagination, the poet, the genius, the dangerous soul. He had become myth to her, half remembered and half created, his presence shaped as much by her memory as by his reality. In this myth she found both pain and comfort, for if he had destroyed her, he had also given her the intensity she had always craved. To imagine him near, even in shadow, was to feel again the fire that had once burned so brightly. To lose him entirely would have been to lose herself. Thus memory, though torment, was also refuge. Her desperate clinging took many forms. She returned to her letters, reading and rereading the fragments she had preserved, as though the ink still carried his breath. She murmured lines of his poetry, repeating them until they became like prayers. She wrote still, shaping novels and fragments that circled always back to him, thinly veiled but transparent to any reader. Each act of writing was another attempt to hold him, to preserve him, to make his shadow tangible. Yet each act also deepened her obsession, for the more she wrote, the more he haunted her. Visitors who saw her in these years were struck by the intensity of her memory. She spoke of Byron not as one long gone, but as though he had only just departed, as though he might return at any moment. She recalled details with startling clarity: the tone of his voice, the way his eyes flickered with irony, the precise words of his letters. At times she grew agitated, recounting his cruelty with fiery indignation. At others she softened, speaking of him with tenderness that belied the pain he had caused her. Madness and memory entwined so closely that one could not separate them. She was possessed not by ghosts, but by the vividness of her own recollection. Her family despaired, her friends avoided her, yet even in her desperation there remained a strange beauty. For Caroline lived her passion wholly, without restraint, without pretense. She did not hide her ruin. She embraced it, even performed it, as though to confess openly was better than to pretend otherwise. In her clinging to Byron's shadow, she revealed the raw truth of love's destructive power, a truth that others concealed, but which she displayed with unflinching honesty. Her health, however, grew weaker still. The fevers returned, her body trembled, her strength faded. Yet her mind, restless and relentless, refused to yield. She read, she wrote, she spoke, she remembered. Those around her urged rest, but she would not rest. To rest was to surrender, and Caroline could not surrender. She had chosen intensity over peace, and even in frailty she held to that choice. There is something haunting in the image of her sitting amid the fragments of the broken mirror, her face pale in the candlelight, her hands stained with ink, her eyes bright with fever. Around her lay the pieces of her reflection, distorted and multiplied, and within her mind lay the fragments of her past, equally sharp, equally dangerous. Both cut her, yet both also defined her. She could not sweep them away. She could only live among them, fragile yet defiant. It was in these years that Caroline seemed most like a figure out of her own novels, half heroine, half ruin, a woman caught between memory and madness. Her life had become literature, her passion a story told again and again, her name inseparable from the man who had destroyed her. She lived not in the present, but in the echo of the past, clinging to shadows as though they were flesh, speaking to ghosts as though they could answer. And yet in this desperate clinging, there was still vitality, still a spark that refused to be extinguished. But shadows, however vivid, cannot sustain life. Memory, however intense, cannot replace presence. Caroline's clinging grew more desperate, more exhausting, until even she must have felt the futility of it. To love a shadow is to embrace emptiness, to grasp air. Her mind knew this, yet her heart refused it, and so she continued, pacing, writing, remembering, clinging, even as her strength waned, even as her life slipped further into legend. On her desk lay a heavy book, its cover worn, its pages filled with her words. She turned its pages slowly, her hand trembling, her breath uneven. She read passages aloud as though hearing her own voice might give them new life. The book contained fragments of herself, pieces of her passion preserved in ink. Yet as she read, she seemed weary, as though even her own words could no longer sustain her. At last she closed the book, its sound heavy in the silence, like the closing of a chapter, the shutting of a door upon a story too painful to continue. The heavy book lay shut upon the desk, its weight pressing into the wood, its silence deeper than the words within. Caroline rested her hand upon its cover, her eyes distant, her thoughts still circling the shadow that would not leave her. The book lies closed, its silence filling the chamber as though it has drawn into itself all that once overflowed upon its pages. Caroline's hand rests upon the cover, her fingers tracing the worn leather, reluctant to let go, yet unable to open it again. And while she sits in this dim solitude, news travels across the seas, borne on letters and messengers, carried from distant lands to the heart of England. Byron, the poet, the lover, the tormentor, the destroyer, has died abroad. He did not perish in the salons of London where his fame first blossomed, nor in the embrace of any lover, nor even in the security of a hearth. He died in Greece, fevered and restless, consumed not by passion alone, but by the storms of politics and exile. Word of his death reached England like a thunderclap, reverberating through the minds of admirers, mourners, enemies, and lovers alike. For Caroline, the news was both end and beginning. The man who had haunted her thoughts, who had tormented her dreams, who had defined her life, was gone. His shadow remained, but the flesh that cast it had perished. To hear of his death was to confront the impossibility of his return, the finality of absence, the certainty that memory was now all that remained. What passed through her mind at that moment we cannot know in certainty. Did she weep, seeing in his death the closing of every door she had left ajar in her heart? Did she feel release, knowing at last that the tormentor was no longer alive to wound her again? Or did she fall into deeper despair, for the shadow could never again be reconciled with the man? Those who recorded her response spoke of sorrow mingled with silence, of a grief that seemed to hollow her further. It was not the grief of a widow, nor of a beloved who had shared long years of companionship. It was the grief of a woman whose life had been marked by passion and humiliation, whose very identity had been entangled with a man who never belonged to her. Byron's death abroad was not only the end of him, but the end of the story she had told herself again and again, that one day he might return, that one day he might turn to her with warmth, that one day her suffering might find its reward. With his death, all such hopes dissolved, and yet in that very dissolution there may have been release, for while he lived she remained chained to him, bound to every rumor, every cruel remark, every silence. In his death he could wound her no longer. He remained only in memory, and memory, though tormenting, was at least unchanging. The Byron she carried in her mind would never again mock her, never again abandon her, never again slam the door upon her heart. He was frozen now in time, both villain and beloved, both genius and destroyer, unalterable, untouchable. For Caroline, who had lived so long in the shadow of his presence, this may have been both devastation and strange relief. England mourned him publicly, with words of sorrow and tributes to his genius. His name was spoken with reverence, his poetry celebrated anew, his death lamented as a loss to the nation. Caroline, however, mourned privately, her grief too entangled with scandal to be expressed openly. She could not join the chorus of public mourning, for her love was remembered as shame, her passion as madness. Yet she felt it more deeply than most, for Byron's life had shaped her ruin, and his death closed the story she had lived so fiercely. In her chamber, the book remained closed upon the desk, her hand resting upon it as though it contained not only her own words, but his as well. Perhaps she thought of the letters she had written him, now long destroyed or hidden away. Perhaps she remembered his verses, the lines that had once seemed written only for her. Perhaps she whispered again her famous phrase, mad, bad, and dangerous to know, as though it were a prayer, an epitaph, a truth confirmed by death. The candle flickered beside her, its light casting her shadow upon the wall, her figure as solitary now as it had ever been. The death of Byron did not end Caroline's obsession, it only transformed it. He became now entirely memory, entirely myth, entirely the figure she had always imagined him to be. She no longer clung to hope of reconciliation, but she clung still to the shadow, speaking of him as though he lingered near, recalling their affair as though it were yesterday. The past, for her, was never past. It was always present, always alive, always burning. Byron's death removed him from the world, but it did not remove him from her. Indeed, it bound him to her more closely, for now she possessed him in memory alone, unchallenged by reality. Those who saw her in the years that followed spoke of a woman still haunted, still restless, still alive with the intensity of passion long after its object had vanished. They pitied her, perhaps, but they also could not forget her, for Caroline embodied what they themselves feared, that love could consume, that passion could destroy, that memory could outlast life itself. Her story, once whispered as scandal, became instead a legend, inseparable from Byron's own. The candle upon her desk burned low, the wax pooling at its base. Caroline, weary, leaned back, her eyes upon the flame. At last, with a faint breath of air from the window, the flame trembled and died, leaving the room in darkness. The extinguishing of the lamp left her in silence, her hand still upon the closed book, her thoughts still upon the man whose shadow would never leave her. The room lay dark, the only sound the faint creak of the house settling, the only light the distant glow of moon upon the window pane. The darkness that followed the lamp's extinguishing was heavy, pressing against the walls and floor, as though the house itself had drawn breath and held it. Caroline sat in that stillness, her hand upon the closed book, her eyes searching the void where flame had been. Darkness suited her now, for it reflected what had settled within. The quiet of exhaustion, the dimming of a spirit once restless with fire. The years had worn her down, not with sudden violence but with slow attrition, each season another thread unraveled, each memory another weight pressing upon her. Her final decline had begun, and though her body lingered, her soul seemed already half departed, dwelling in the shadows where memory lived. Her health grew frailer by the day. She was often confined to her bed, her strength too weak for pacing, her voice too faint for long speeches. The wildness that had once burst forth in laughter and tears was tempered now by weariness, though it had not vanished entirely. There were moments when her old fire flashed, when her eyes glimmered with sudden wit, when her tongue cut sharply against those who spoke down to her. But these moments were rare, brief embers of brilliance in a body that could no longer sustain flame. More often she lay in silence, staring at the ceiling, her mind wandering through corridors of memory where Byron still walked beside her. She spoke of him still, though more softly now, no longer with the wild declarations that once startled her companions, no longer with the furious reproaches that once filled her letters, but with a quieter voice, as though speaking to herself. Byron had become less a figure of torment than a constant presence, woven into every thought, every breath. Even in her decline, she could not release him. To her, he was not gone. He lingered always, in shadow, in memory, in words repeated, until they seemed to echo in the air. Those who attended her grew weary of hearing his name, yet she spoke it gently, almost tenderly, as though in these last years she had forgiven what she could not forget. Her isolation deepened. Society, which had long since abandoned her, paid little attention to her fading. Her family, estranged, visited rarely. William, faithful still, remained near, though sorrow had carved his face. He offered care without reproach, patience without expectation, yet Caroline received his kindness as one receives a gift they cannot repay. Her love for him had never been the passion he deserved, and in her decline she seemed to know this more clearly than ever. Yet she did not deny him. She accepted his presence, his steady hand, his quiet sorrows, as though at last she recognized the gentleness that had accompanied her ruin without judgment. The decline of her body mirrored the decline of her world. The grand salons were no longer hers. The laughter of society no longer concerned her. What remained were the confines of her room, the slow passage of hours, the flicker of candlelight, the sound of rain or wind against the window. Within these small moments her life shrank, yet her memory expanded, filling the silence with scenes of the past. She lived less in the present than in the echoes of years before, when passion still burned, when scandal still surrounded her, when Byron still lived. It was as though she had stepped out of time, lingering only in recollection, her body still present, but her spirit wandering through what once was. Those who saw her in these final years spoke of a woman who seemed both frail and formidable, diminished in strength, yet not in intensity. Her madness, if it can be so called, was gentler now, less violent, more like a dream from which she could not wake. She muttered lines of poetry under her breath, fragments of Byron's verses and her own. She sang at times, her voice thin but still sweet, songs that no one recognized but which carried for her the music of memory. She reached out her hand at times as though to touch someone unseen, her fingers trembling in the air. To watch her was to witness not merely decline, but a slow crossing into another realm, half here and half beyond. The room around her bore the marks of her life, letters stacked in drawers, books upon the table, fragments of drafts abandoned, the shattered mirror still hidden in a corner, covered but never removed. All were relics of her passion, remnants of the woman she had been. To enter her chamber was to step into a shrine of memory, where every object whispered of Byron, of love, of ruin. Her attendants kept the space quiet, but they could not keep memory at bay. It lingered in the very air, inseparable from her presence, and as her body weakened further, her nights grew longer. She lay awake while the house slept, staring into the darkness, listening to the silence. At times she murmured prayers, though they sounded more like confessions. At times she whispered Byron's name, as though calling him from across the gulf. At times she only breathed, her chest rising and falling faintly, her lips moving without sound. The night seemed endless, and yet she endured it, one breath at a time. Her death, when it came, was not sudden but slow, like the dimming of a flame that has burned too long. There was no violent collapse, no final scene of passion. Instead, there was weariness, a body too tired to continue, a heart too burdened to beat further. She lay upon her bed, her eyes half closed, her breath shallow. Those near her spoke of her muttering still, though they could not hear the words. Perhaps she spoke of Byron, perhaps she prayed, perhaps she spoke only to herself. At last her breath grew fainter, then ceased. The silence that followed was deeper than any she had ever endured, for it was the silence of finality. The house was hushed, the candles burning low. Outside, the sky was dark, the world indifferent. Within, Caroline Lamb lay still, her restless spirit at last quiet, her passion at last ended, her memory only beginning. For though her life had been scandal, her death was peace, and her story would linger far longer than the whispers of her contemporaries. The hour of her passing was marked not by laughter, nor by gossip, nor by scenes of passion, but by the slow toll of midnight, each strike echoing through the silence as though marking the end of a chapter, the close of a life lived too brightly, too recklessly, too fiercely to be forgotten. The bell tolled again, slow, heavy, unyielding, carrying through the night. Midnight lingered in the air long after the final toll of the bell had faded, as though the hour itself resisted moving forward, unwilling to close the story of a life so restless, so tumultuous, so consumed by passion. Caroline Lamb lay still now, her body surrendered to silence, her spirit no longer pacing the corridors of memory, And yet in that stillness her presence endured, not as flesh and voice, but as legend, woven inseparably into the life and ruin of Lord Byron. For history is seldom kind, and it remembers most vividly not serenity but scandal, not peace but passion. Caroline's name would live on, carried not by her novels, nor by her beauty, nor even by her wit, but by a single phrase, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. That phrase, uttered in a moment of anguish, became her legacy, echoing across generations, attached forever to Byron's myth. Yet, in speaking of him, she also defined herself, for she was remembered as the woman who dared to love dangerously, who dared to confess openly, who dared to live without restraint in a world that punished such daring. Was it Byron who ruined her, or did she ruin herself through her refusal to conform? The question lingers, unanswered, echoing through the centuries like the toll of that midnight bell. Her story is one of paradox. She was a woman of privilege, yet her privilege could not shield her. She was a woman of wit and talent, yet her gifts became overshadowed by her scandal. She was a woman of passion, yet her passion destroyed her. She loved Byron with a devotion so fierce that it consumed her, and in loving him, she gave him not only her heart, but her reputation, her peace, her very sanity. And yet, without that passion, who would remember her at all? Had she lived quietly, obediently, respectably, she might have been forgotten like so many others of her rank. Instead, she lives in memory, a figure both tragic and luminous, her ruin inseparable from her vitality. It is tempting to pity her, to see in her life only waste and sorrow. Yet there is also a strange courage in her refusal to hide. She did not pretend, she did not dissemble, she did not bury her passion beneath the silence demanded of women of her time. She spoke, she wrote, she performed, she confessed. Her openness was her ruin, but it was also her truth. In a world that rewarded hypocrisy, she chose honesty, however destructive. And in that honesty lies her enduring fascination. Byron, for all his genius, remains remembered as the archetype of the dark and dangerous poet. But Caroline's words gave him that epithet, and in giving it, she shaped the way the world would see him. Without her, his myth might have been less vivid, his legend less enduring. She gave him his most famous description, even as she was destroyed by him. Thus her legacy is not only her ruin, but his immortality, entwined forever in words as sharp as they are unforgettable. Her novels, though seldom read now, reveal more of her soul than any gossip ever could. In their pages one finds not only bitterness and revenge, but also vulnerability, longing, and the desire to be understood. They are the cries of a woman who lived too fiercely, who suffered too openly, who sought to transform her passion into art. They may not have secured her literary fame, but they preserved her voice. And in that voice, one still hears the tremor of truth. The memory of Caroline Lamb asks us questions that remain unresolved. Was she victim or agent? Was she destroyed by Byron, or by the society that condemned her, or by her own unyielding spirit? Was her madness born of love, or of the loss of it? There are no certain answers, only fragments like the shards of her broken mirror, each reflecting a different image, each cutting with its own sharp edge. To contemplate her life is to stand before those fragments, seeing in them not only her story, but also the eternal danger of passion, unrestrained. And yet perhaps there is beauty even in her ruin. For to love with such intensity, to live with such openness, to refuse to conceal one's truth, even at the cost of destruction, is a kind of bravery few possess. Caroline lived dangerously, and though it destroyed her, it also made her unforgettable. Her name, whispered in scandal, endures in legend. Her phrase, born of anguish, has become immortal. Her story, tragic and luminous, remains a warning and a wonder. Midnight lingers still, heavy and silent, as though time itself pauses in respect for a soul that burned too brightly. The darkness holds the memory of her laughter, her tears, her words, her ruin. And in that darkness, one hears not judgment but an open question. Was she undone by Byron or by herself? The silence offers no answer, only the echo of her own phrase, drifting softly through the centuries. Mad, bad, and dangerous to know. The question remains, unresolved, lingering like the last toll of the bell, fading into silence.